To those of you who are joining us for the first time today, welcome to Food Systems Friday. This webinar is organized by the Sustainable Food Systems faculty at Prescott College. I'm Robin Curry, and I'm the director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program. And it's an intentionally online program that seeks to support students and their efforts to build more sustainable food systems in their own communities without having to relocate and move out of their place. Place is very important to us. We started this webinar series because COVID-19 has definitely put a spotlight on food supply chains, and clearly many of our existing food systems are not equitably ensuring food for all, even in the best of times. For those of you who are less familiar with what food systems are, food systems encompass everything, all the stages involved in keeping us nourished. So that's the growing, the harvesting, the packaging, the processing, the transforming, the marketing, the transporting, the distribution, the consuming, and we would hope not too much disposal of food. You know, as a faculty, we've been thinking about the increased vulnerability to food security that has happened as a result of isolation measures associated with COVID, and tribal communities have been disproportionately impacted. We recognize food as a human right and have also been thinking about how food is racialized. And we just feel so strongly that now more than ever, we all have important work to do to ensure safe, resilient food systems. So the big question though is, how do we get it right? And that's what this series focuses on. So we focus on policies, practices, and people who can show us and help us learn about models of sustainable food systems and communities, such as our guests who have joined us here today. For those of you, I'll be doing introductions in just a moment, but for those of you who are not familiar, we offer the webinar every 2 weeks, and so we'll be airing again on August 21st, and Dr. Michelle Perro will be our guest, and the conversation will focus on the impact of chemical inputs on child health and wellness, especially in Latinx communities who are disproportionately affected. So if you've joined us here today, you'll get an automatic invitation to that webinar and a reminder. And I would like to introduce Lisa Trocchia, my colleague, Dr. Lisa Trocchia, who is here as a wonderful partner to make sure everything goes smoothly for our webinar. So I'll hand the mic over to you, Lisa, for a moment.
Sure, thanks, Robin, and just want to reiterate that welcome to everyone for taking the time to join us for what's going to be a wonderful webinar. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about Zoom. Most of you have become Zoom pros at this point, but if any of you are just joining the webinar format for the first time, I'll run through a few details that could be helpful. Just to let you know, first off, that the webinar is recorded. We make the webinar available free via our website for folks who aren't able to attend. So please understand that when you participate in the chat, you're just agreeing to allow Prescott College the option to capture what you've expressed or any of the resources you've shared to distribute as part of the webinar series. And, you know, we really do appreciate that because not everybody can join us in real time, and many folks do choose to watch the webinar later. So the technical thing I want to just point out is that for the duration of the webinar, your audio will be muted and your video will be off. So it would be really wonderful if you would be willing to introduce yourself in the chat. So to do that, you take your cursor and place it at the bottom of the page, and it'll bring up the toolbar, and there you see a talk bubble. And this is just a toggle, and it'll bring up the chat space, and you'll see a little blue rectangle that tells you who you're communicating to if you send a message. So this chat space is really a great community building space, and I encourage you to take a minute now to say hello, provide a brief introduction, let us know where you are, and feel free to say a few words about why you registered for the webinar today. And, you know, if it's appropriate and you're comfortable with that, please feel free to share email contacts as well. You can also ask a question for the speakers in the chat or via the Q&A space, which is also accessed through the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom page. So just want to let you know, somebody from Prescott will be monitoring both of these spaces in case you encounter technical problems. If you have questions for the speakers or have comments, you want to share resources, whatever. Again, you know, this space is very dynamic, it's spontaneous, it's resource rich. So I encourage you to participate as fully as you can. And again, please take a quick minute to say hello, and I guess we'll just get started. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. So as part of Food Systems Friday, we made a decision to focus more recently on the idea of the human right to food. And this is recognized. The United Nations recognizes, and in aspects of the international law also, that there is a human right to adequate food. Regretfully, that was just in 1999, but you know, we will take strides when we have them. And just so that we're all clear on how the UN is framing their human rights approach to food. So it's the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement. The right to adequate food shall therefore not be interpreted in a narrow or restrictive sense, which equates it with the minimum package of calories, proteins, and specific nutrients. And regretfully, that is what we in the United States have had a history of doing. I also want to mention that the committee considers that the core content of the right to adequate food implies the following. It implies that food is available in the quantity and quality sufficient to meet dietary needs, that it should be free from adverse substances. So we'll speak to that next week with Michelle Perro also, and acceptable within a given culture. And the second thing that the right to adequate food implies, according to the UN, is that the accessibility of the food is in manner that is sustainable and does not interfere with other human rights. So this is our framing, and this is why we are here today. And you are taking the time to join us today shows that you care about these issues, and we really appreciate your participation. But this is also why I invited Mark Ford, who is the Director of Gifts and Partnerships for Partnership with Native Americans, and Rafael Tapia, who's the Vice President of Programs, also with Partnership for Native Americans. So welcome to both of you, Mark and Rafael, and I'm happy to turn the mic over to the two of you, and thank you.
Hello, everyone. Yatehe, Tananzo, Hailito, Hahanewashte. Those are all greetings in 4 different languages of tribes in this country who have a strong presence: Apache, Navajo, Choctaw, and Lakota. And so I'm honored to be with you all today. As we begin, I would want to ask forgiveness to my elders and to my ancestors, as well as my Native brothers and sisters here, for speaking on your behalf. But we're honored to be here to be with you and willing to share a little bit about tribal history, about partnership with Native Americans and what we do, and some of the initiatives going on in Indian country around food access and food sovereignty. And I'll let Rafael introduce himself.
Thank you, Dr. Curry and Mark. Leosam Chaniawo, Kachamalia, Aisamen Ane, Kavekoko, Inepo Rafael Tapia Tiak, Into I Carmen Romero Tapia Tiak, Into Achai Rafael Frias Tapia Yowe Tiak. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited about today's conversation and look forward to engaging you as you may bring up questions or comments. So I'm looking forward to today's session. Thank you very much.
Well, we'd just like to start off maybe sharing a little bit about partnership with Native Americans. And we have a slideshow that we're going to put up, and you're welcome to follow along with. Partnership with Native Americans. So we're celebrating our 30th anniversary as an organization. We call ourselves PWNA for short, because Partnership with Native Americans is a whole sentence. So so PWNA, you'll refer ourselves as that. So I think we're going to share the screen right now. A little bit about our organization, just some basic stuff. Let's see if we go to the first slide. We serve tribes in a 9-state region with regular service. The Northern Plains and the Southwest, the 9 states that we provide services for tribes are South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, Utah, and Colorado. And we work mostly with rural, geographically isolated tribes, under-resourced tribes. We have a number of services and programs. I'll let Rafael share that, but our mission is to serve immediate needs and to support long-term solutions. Our vision is self-sustaining tribal Native American communities. So the whole idea is that we do immediate needs to assist tribes, but we also do sustainable long-term programs. We also service tribes outside of our region for disasters, disaster relief, and also with our scholarship program. And I'm going to let Rafael share a little bit about our programs that we have available.
Thank you, Mark. Folks, I apologize. I did not address the fact that I am a member of the Pasquayaki tribe, and that was a greeting in our language. It pretty much says that asking Creator to bless this time we're together, because it may not come again. The thing is that we always also ask for permission from our elders and those we're presenting. And so that's kind of hard to do in this, but I ask you for permission to say, and we usually say a few words, but we love to talk, I'll tell you. We'll say, well, with these few words, and then next thing you know, we're still talking about things about a couple hours later. But I'll keep it brief. As Mark mentioned, we have a 9-state footprint, and we serve hundreds of tribal communities within those 9 states. We do so through a dual focus program, the immediate needs, and these are material resources that we invest in the community through partnerships, active partnerships, and these are through the schools, the youth programs, the elder centers, and some of the essential government services. And so we have these partnerships that allow us to have a greater impact in investing these resources. And at the end of the day, what we're focused on is improving, impacting the quality of life for the citizens. We also have a long-term solutions component, and that focuses a lot on asset development, capacity building, and the two are married together. We've got to make sure we are investing today in what needs are, and we do so not on a needs-based focus approach, but on a strength-based focus approach. We're not giving a handout. We're working side by side with partners, and so prioritizing our resources and focusing those resources on what the community defines as important to quality of life. We have 2 distribution centers, 45,000 square foot facilities with trucks that allow us to disperse our resources, and then staff that allow us to also go in and engage with the community. As we all know, things have changed, but we are shifting into an online platform to make sure that we are still engaging our communities and providing the critical services. I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Great. We're one of the largest Native serving organizations in the country, and our scope of service, as Rafael's mentioned, is very diverse. So we support education programs, including scholarships. We support animal welfare programs in reservation communities, food distribution, again, the capacity building programs that Rafael shared. So our hands a little bit of everything. And so again, you know, we're just proud to be a resource for people. One thing that we also do, we're an intermediary service, is being able to connect outside resources to tribal communities. And so we're just happy to be part. I've been with Partnership with Native Americans for, it'll be 10 years in November. My background originally, I was started my career as a Catholic priest. I did that for 16 years, including 7 years of working on the Navajo and Hopi reservations. And then I worked for the Governor's Office of Louisiana under 2 different administrations, working with tribes, especially after Hurricane Katrina and the other hurricanes that impacted that area. So anyway, we're just really proud to be presenting today. We're now going to do a little bit of work around tribal history and understanding what has happened in the United States, in this country, that has affected the food system. So taking it from that perspective, but we also have to look at what are the policies and the laws and the things that took place in history that we often don't hear about, the things that we're not taught in school. And so we're going to now do that. And so if we could go to the next slide. So one of the things that everyone asks is, what do we call you? Are you Native Americans? Are you American Indians? Are you, you know, sometimes you hear First Americans. In Canada, First Nations is used, Indigenous. When you look at the census questions, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian is always slashed along with American Indians. So it depends on who you're asking and what they want to be called. So a lot of the government and academic usage is American Indians. More of nonprofits, and others use Native Americans. So I would say ask the person who you're talking to what they would like to be called. I'm going to refer mostly to Native Americans throughout this presentation. Where do we live? So Native Americans live just about every place, but specifically for some tribes, there's reservations, and I'll talk a little bit more about reservations in upcoming slide. Tribal communities, we hear tribal communities. Sometimes those are not land-based or reservation-based tribes, but they just call themselves communities. Rancherias, you'll find those in Northern California. Missions, that'll be Southern California, even in Arizona, there's missions. Pueblos, you'll find those in New Mexico. Villages, you'll hear that a lot in Alaska. And then urban and rural, so we're both, you'll find this just about anywhere. And how do we identify with our culture, heritage, tradition? So there's kind of 3 classifications. One is traditional. Those who grow up speaking the language, who maybe grew up with the culture, with the, maybe on a reservation, with their tribal community. They're very steeped and knowledgeable about their spirituality, the culture, the origins. Bicultural, those who could live in both worlds. Who both can live in American mainstream society as well as hold on to their language, their culture, and their traditions, and usually feel comfortable in both worlds. Integrated are those like myself who never grew up on a reservation. I'm not a card-carrying Native American. I'll explain what that means later on too. But maybe we learned our culture and our heritage later in life, or we're very connected to our spirituality and to our traditions and our heritage. So those are kind of the 3 distinctions with Native Americans. Next slide. So Native population in the United States, this is from 2010 census. It'll be interesting to see what happens with 2020 census. So we have a population about 2.9 million, or 0.9% of the population, that consider themselves fully Native American. And then another part of us are 5.2 million who are mixed. Native American, maybe a couple tribes, maybe some Spanish, some you know, Irish or other mixtures as well. So pretty much a mix of Native and other. The states with the highest proportion of Native Americans is Alaska with 19.5%, Oklahoma 12.9%, New Mexico 10.7%, and Arizona and South Dakota follow closely after that as well. 71% of Native Americans live in urban settings. This is an important thing that we'll come back to as we look at a little more of what's happened through our history and why this is the case. Okay. So we always hear about federally recognized tribes, and in this country there are 573 federally recognized tribes. These are tribes that have a government-government relationship between the tribal nation and the United States. That number goes up and down every year because some tribes are added on to the federal recognition list and others are maybe taken off. And then we have state recognized tribes. These are tribes that are in states where the state government has an official relationship with that tribe, but the federal government doesn't. And then the third type of tribes out there are what we call bands or other configurations. And there's about 200, maybe a little more than that in this country. And these are tribes that maybe have not been, or maybe were federally recognized at one time, no longer are. Maybe they were connected with a larger tribe or a larger group of natives, but aren't recognized by them or don't quite fit. Some of these include those who hid out during the Trail of Tears, during the westward movement, and they just kind of hid out. They still retained their culture and heritage, but they lost that connection with the larger tribe or larger communities. To become a federally recognized tribe, there's 4 ways you can do that in this country. One is working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is part of the Department of Interior, the BIA, and it's developing some policies and some procedures, treaties with the BIA to make you a federally recognized tribe. Another way is through an act of Congress. The third way is through a presidential executive order, and the final way is through the federal courts saying this tribe exists. So tribes have been recognized in pretty much all those ways, but those are ways that tribes are seeking recognition who aren't federally recognized at this point. There are 326 reservations. Reservations are land-based tribes, land that is given, that is allotted to the tribes to live on. It doesn't mean that tribes own the land. It's federal land that the tribes have access to live on, and but they don't own the land. And so there's 326, but if you notice we have 573 tribes. That means there's a lot of tribes that weren't given reservation land to live on. We also have tribes who have no, as I mentioned, but there's tribes that share a reservation. So a good example of that is the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. There's 2 tribes that share that reservation, the Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshones. And it's interesting that this was by intention. These tribes were not friends with one another. In fact, they were enemies, but the government forced them to live together. And when we as an organization would work with that reservation, we have to work with 2 different tribal governments to have access, to communicate, to provide services. You have to work with both of those government officials or government entities as tribes, just even though they're on one reservation. And then you have tribes that have more than one reservation. So the Navajo, even Rafael's tribe has several locations where they live, the Pasquayakis. Okay, next slide. So some of the things that have happened, these are kind of just some eras in the United States around policy and things that took place throughout history. First of all, you know, when Columbus came to this country, to this continent, it was 1492. It changed the lives of both the Europeans, but also the indigenous people who lived in this continent. So from that time on, explorers began to come to this country and to settle here. You know, we understand a lot of the perspective we were taught is colonization through the English colonies that were set up in the eastern part of our country. But colonization happened way before that with the Spanish. And the Spanish were the first to come in the 1400s and early 1500s and to settle in Florida, in Mexico, in California, in that part of the country, Louisiana. And then we had the French that came in and also colonized this area, especially along the eastern coast and up at the Canadian border. Also Louisiana, they came in there as well. So So we had several colonizations. In Alaska, we had the Russians that colonized part of Alaska. So there were several colonizations that happened, and they happened in different forms. When the Spanish came here, they didn't push out the indigenous people. What they did was they moved in, and they where the indigenous people celebrated their ceremonies and had temples and worship. Those were knocked down, and the Catholic churches and missions were built. The government centers for the tribes were also demolished, and the Spanish government centers then were set up where those were located. So they didn't push away tribes from their lands. They settled and conquered them in that way, spiritually and otherwise. And then the English settlers and the Dutch reformed settlers and those that came from Europe and settled in the 13 colonies, as they begin to expand, that's the expansion that a lot of us grew up with, learning that whole side. So some of the things that happened from 1492 to 1928 included a lot of disease, a lot of taking away the culture, again, forced Catholicism or Christianity on tribal governments, intermarrying with natives. So if you look in the Southwest, a lot of the tribes here in the Southwest have Hispanic surnames. The Apaches, a lot of the Pueblos, the Yaquis, the Hispanic surnames, because that's the names that we adopted. So we as a people in the Southwest, us tribes, we're products of colonization from the Spanish. Just as many tribes in the northern part of the Canadian border are also products of colonization with the French. You'll see a lot of French names up in that area, Minnesota and the Dakotas and so forth. So the one next era is the removal, reservation, and treaty era. As the westward expansion began to happen, Native people were forced out of their homelands. Disease was given unintentionally, but also intentionally, to Native people. A lot of racist policies began at that time. And there's some, believe it or not, there are still some laws in states that are very racist towards Indians. For example, in Montana and South Dakota, to this day, in those state law records, it is against the law for seven or more Native Americans to gather together in one space. It's seen as a war party, and it's allowed by law for them to be shot and killed. Those are still on the books in South Dakota and Montana. So there are a number of states that still have strange laws that show that those racist policies towards Native Americans. We just celebrated our country, the Independence Day last month. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, there is a whole phrase in there about American Indian savages and that whole need to move them out. So, so there's a lot of things within our own government laws and policies that still exist that are very racist. During this time, we had the Trail of Tears. This is the movement of tribes from their homes, their ancestral homes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminoles, what we call the 5 civilized tribes, along with other tribes from the east and the south to Oklahoma, to that whole Oklahoma territory. And it was a forced, painful, long march. Many people died along the way. Again, some of those tribes escaped and hid out in the south, and there are those bands and non-recognized tribes as a result of that. In the Southwest, we had our own Trail of Tears with the Navajo and some Apaches that were forced out of their lands into New Mexico. They call it the Long Walk. And there was a lot of death. It was during the winter time. And anyway, that was another force. We also hear about the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, Little Bighorn Massacre. I'm sorry, not Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. So there were a lot of things that went on that people didn't know about. The next era was allotment and assimilation. This was forcing tribes into the reservations, so the beginning of the reservation system, and the first attempt to assimilate Native people by taking their children out of their families and sending them to boarding school, cutting their hair, only allowing them to speak English, and to forget their culture, their spirituality. If you look at the pictures on this slide, these are the same group of children. So the top children are Apache children forced into a boarding school, and this is what they look like after they've been incorporated in the school. The sad thing about these, a lot of children were abused, a lot of them died. Those who tried to go back to their tribe or to their communities were not accepted, or they couldn't understand their grandparents who spoke their language, but they didn't speak the language anymore, so they didn't fit in. So this is part of our history and our, what's happened to us. The next era is 1934 to 68, and this is just this last century. One of the big things that happened was the reduction of the federally recognized tribes. What was happening, some of these tribes were becoming wealthy because they were getting land rights, mineral rights, whether it was gold or oil or other things. And the government says, oh, these tribes don't need to exist anymore. So let's unfederally recognize them. So they were no longer federally, there was over 100 tribes. And there were the tribes, again, that were doing very well successfully with oil or mineral rights, or, and so that was the government's attempt to get rid of them. The second thing was, they said, Indians aren't working in the reservations. There's no jobs there. So let's get them to go to the cities. So what they did is they offered a stipend to Native Americans. If you move in the city, we'll pay your first month's rent in a little apartment. We'll give you a stipend to find a job and maybe get some training. We'll do some training for you and get you in the city. You're going to become a true American by living in the city. So that's why we had in the earlier slide, 71% of Native Americans live in urban areas. And that was a result of that. That also brought in the illusion or the misperception that Native Americans are taken care of by the government because they were given the stipend to move. They were given the opportunity, here's your job for you, or get out of the reservation. So there's this myth that Native Americans are fully funded by the government. So those are some of the misperceptions that go on, and part of it was the acts during this time. The interesting is the tribes begin to fight around this time because the tribes had come back from World War I and World War II and they began to really relish in their culture and be proud of their heritage, because we had a lot of Native people who served in the military during World War I and World War II. Here the Navajo code talkers, Lakota code talkers, Choctaw code talkers, and these were heroes. They came back to their communities as heroes, and they were proud of their culture, proud of being Navajo and Choctaw. And so they fought some of these things against the federal government, and some of them were successful as a result of that. And the last part is the self-determined era. So 1968, when Johnson was president, there was a congressman in Oklahoma whose wife was Native American, and she helped promote that every federal agency have funding set aside just for tribal programs. So every federal agency has a tribal serving entity within that department, either for funding or for programs that supports tribes alone. It doesn't mean that everything was well, because tribes still have to compete against each other for that funding and for those programs, but it did open the door for some tribal sovereignty to begin. There were some other things that have happened in recent times that have enhanced tribal sovereignty. The Sandy Act allowed tribes to declare a disaster on their own without having to go through the state. There's other things that have happened, but it's still a struggle for tribes. Rafael, do you want to jump on it all and add to anything I mentioned?
No, Mark, just a really good overview. I think two parts in terms of that number that you mentioned, the 70% urban, rural. I think the other component is that there's always been an intentional plan to starve the people on the reservation and limit the development process so that the option is to assimilate and integrate into the local communities. And that's still an ongoing challenge that's taking place. I think one of the newest eras that we have now that is not identified here is the tribal consultation era, where now there is an intention on behalf of the federal government and then the local governments to consult with tribes. And so making that a government to government exchange on anything that's going on, anything that will affect those tribal communities. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you, Rafael, for pointing this out. Okay, next slide. So here's some historical facts that are not well known to the public that I'd like to share with you. So Native Americans didn't become US citizens till 1924, even though we've been in this country centuries, thousands of years before Europeans got here. And this came about when Native Americans became, a lot of Native Americans signed up for World War I to fight in that war. And they came back again as heroes. And so there was a couple of generals in the military who recognized that and helped push for Native Americans to become US citizens. But that's what it took for us to become citizens in this country. And it was that reason for the military service. Native Americans weren't allowed to vote in all 50 states until 1962. The last state that allowed Native Americans to vote was in New Mexico. So our ability to vote was limited, just as women and other minority groups as well. From 1870 to 1934, Native Americans were banned from practicing any religious, spiritual, traditional, or cultural ceremonies at all. That included hunting, fishing, foraging, growing, planting, any types of ceremonies that were centered around growing and planting and harvesting. All those things were banned. It would be like telling us you cannot go to church, you cannot practice your religion. And yet this country was founded on freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And yet it wasn't until 1934 that Native Americans were allowed to do that again. And that was on a limited basis even. Before colonization, there was a population of about 18 million in North America, not just the United States, but North America. When in the 1890 census of US, the number had fallen to 228,000. So the one thing we can say is we're resilient people. We can come back, and thank God for that. Before colonization, there were over 300 languages, probably more than that, spoken. Today, there's 154, and that number drops every year. Next slide. Now we're going to look at what were foods like pre-colonization. Next slide. So a lot of people didn't realize this, but a lot of tribes in this country were farming agricultural tribes, especially the East Coast, the South, the California area, a lot of tribes in the Southwest as well, the Pueblos and Navajo, and a good number of tribes were agricultural tribes. And so we're going to learn about what those crops that they grew. You can see in the picture there, corn was, of course, the most well-known crop at that time. But let's go on the next slide. The other tribes were also hunter-gatherer tribes. Now, all tribes in the United States were hunter-gatherers. It's just that some were predominantly that. And so a lot of the tribes in the Northern Plains, the Apache tribes, a lot of Alaska tribes, those tribes that were nomadic or migratory like Cheyenne and other tribes, Apache tribes, were hunter-gatherers, we call them. Okay. Next slide. So what are the main crops that were grown in this country that are indigenous to North America? And this one you have to click. I forgot this has you have to do one at a time. So this is usually interactive when you ask people what they think they are. So corn, squash, beans, the three sisters we call them because they're usually grown together. Potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, and chocolate. These are foods that originated in North America, and some came from South America, like the potatoes came from South America, but all the others came from the Americas and were distributed to the world. Now we can say maybe the Italians, you know, helped refine the tomatoes through their pasta sauces, or the Asians really enhanced their food with chili peppers, and but you know, or the Irish, you know, helped really get potatoes globally known. But it's really, these came from the Americas, and these were crops grown by the indigenous people in this continent. Next slide, please. These are other crops and food sources that were indigenous to this country and to this continent. You know, pineapple pie, pecans, you can see the list there. But here's the interesting fact: 60% of foods now used in the world originated in the Americas. 60% of the foods. This is important because, as we're going to see, these foods Native people did not have access to for many years. So anyway, let's go ahead and move on. So I just want to talk briefly about the spirituality of food. And when I talk about it, this is such an important part of Native Americans' connection with food. Food is medicine. It's healing. It teaches us. It's part of it's part of our makeup. So that connection that all relatives and all plants all plants and animals are our relatives. We're connected with them, and when we eat them, their spirit, their characteristics are given, or we take in, and they become part of us. So the honoring, so the honoring of those foods, the honoring of the animals, the honoring of the plants is such an important part of the culture. So the ceremonies of hunting, of fishing, of gathering crops, of harvesting, of planting, those are an essential part of the culture and traditions, and is part of the food system that was so important to indigenous and to native cultures. Eating with good intentions. So when we sit down to eat, it's important for us not to be angry. It's important for us not to carry you know, what we associate as negative feelings. Because if we're coming to a position where we come to the table to eat and we're carrying anxiety or fear or anguish or anger, then what happens is that food that we're digesting cannot digest well. We can't absorb those nutrients into our cells, into our body, into our makeup. So coming in good attitude is an important thing. So offering prayers beforehand and after is part of the traditions for many of our tribes. I talked about the ceremonies. Food preservation is important because, especially in those tribes that existed in harsh winters, having that food available that's canned, preserved, that's dried, that's available to eat during those winter months is so important. So food preservation was also an important aspect of food access. Meals were always family and community oriented. So eating together is such an important part of relationship building and spiritual connection as well. Three things I just kind of want to mention briefly of some traditions that I think are real special. In the tribes in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest especially, including parts of Canada and even Alaska, the traditions of potlatch ceremonies. These were times that they get together and they look at, or they give away their most prized possessions. And it was kind of a way of like establishing yourself socially within your community, within your tribe, or among other tribes. But there always was a big meal, was always full of food and feasting and celebration. And this is where we get the word potluck from. Everybody brings something that's special to them to a meal. So this is where we get the word potluck from. Watecha is a Lakota word. A Lakota word that means leftovers, but it's more than just leftovers. It's about bringing, so whenever you have a celebration with a meal with the Lakota people, you cook double the amount of the people that you're expecting. So if you're expecting 100 people, you cook like if 200 people are coming, because everyone's going to bring their Tupperware or their gallon-sized baggie or their Ziploc bag, or Ziploc containers, or their margarine containers that are empty now. So they bring food home And it's not just about eating leftovers. It's about bringing back and recalling the relationships that you built at that gathering, the conversation that you had, the relationship building, and the spiritual event that happened. You're reliving that. For us Christians, it's called Eucharist. Kind of like what Jesus did when we do the Last Supper. The Last Supper is like, every time you do this, think of me. That's Watecha. That's what that means. It's not just leftovers. It's reliving that event and that celebration you had with others. And then the spirit plate, some tribes have this tradition of before you eat, you take a little bit of all the food that has been prepared, put it on a plate, and you present it to the creator or to the spirits, to the ancestors, and you honor them that way. It's a way of showing gratitude, a way of showing connection with those who've gone before us, as well as connection with the creator. Next one. Food is medicine. You know, we really pretty much talked about this, but it's such an important part that everything we eat has some healing qualities, some characteristics that give life and substance and nourishment. So recognizing that when we eat a plant, when we eat an animal, it's not just about filling our stomachs. It's about filling our souls. It's about filling our spirits and connecting us with nature. There's something deeper and richer than just filling bellies. It's a spiritual way of life. It's a connectedness with everything and everyone around us. Let's go ahead and go on. You know, and the other thing that really influenced in early Native American pre-colonization, there was a lot of migration. There was trading centers in this country and in this continent where Native people came together. They shared recipes, they shared food, they shared exchanges of seeds and plants and animals. And so the richness of the food and access to food was more than just, you know, isolated in regions, but there was a connection and a trading and a marketing place that took place. If everyone has ever heard, most people have not heard about this, but there's a thing called, there's a place called Poverty Point, Louisiana. It's a UN historical site. Nobody knows about it, but it was a center of trading for tribes, especially in the plains in the South. And it's near the Mississippi River. So tribes came there and it was a big marketplace. And tribes from all over, they found parrot feathers or macaw feathers from Central America and South America. They found salmon bones and whale bones from the Northwest regions of the United States and in Alaska. So they found places from all over. So this is a place of center, but nobody knows about it, including Native people. But look at it, Poverty Point, Louisiana. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this now we're looking at what happened to food after colonization. And some of these are things we already touched upon. So next slide, please. So we already mentioned about the Trail of Tears or the Long Walk. So the idea is that Native people were forced out of their ancestral lands where they grew crops or they accessed food. They no longer had that area. They were now living in new places. A lot of places were deserts, or they didn't know the soil. They didn't know that the seasons were, the winters were much longer and harsher there. So it just undid everything that they had in regards of access to food. That relocation just destroyed that. Next slide, please. I mentioned, you know, they were forced, so the food sources changed. And also some were wiped out. The government literally went in and wiped out buffalo herds. This pile here, this picture is a pile of buffalo skulls of thousands and probably tens of thousands of buffalo. Because if you kill the food, the sources of food, then you starve the people and you have control over them. You know, food was used as a weapon. It was used as a way of controlling people. The boarding schools was a way of losing culture and traditions and learning your food systems, and you're dependent on products that are, you know, the food that's given to you by the schools. Next slide, please. So the foods that were introduced to Native Americans were not part of the foods. You know, we gave those 8 main food sources. Wheat was not on that list. Sugar was not on that list. Milk or dairy products were not on that list. Definitely alcohol and processed foods. These are things that were now given by the federal government through the commodity program to Native Americans because they, again, for so many years, they were not allowed to hunt or fish or forage or grow. Here's what we're giving you to eat. It's a way of controlling. It's a way of assimilating, and it's a way of eliminating Native people. Okay. And now I'm going to hand this over to Rafael, and he's going to share with you a little bit more of what's happening in Indian country. I'm just aware of the time too, but Rafael, I think we have about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'll you know, make sure we cover some of the fine points. You know, this whole food as medicine and the relationship with, it's holistic. I think we had the best health and wellness plan nationwide here in this continent that we've never seen before, because everything was related: the food, the ceremony, the people, the engagement, and so there was a lot of folks that were very healthy, very much a part of the community. Even people that had mental health issues in our society today, we look at people that hear voices that they have a problem. In some of our communities, somebody that heard voices was gifted. And so there was a different acculturation with the way we looked at things, including the role of food. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this next few slides, and how we've incorporated into our practices, because we don't deal with just a single community or a single state where we can specialize. So I want to talk about that. I agree with the point that was made earlier, that food is still weaponized. And for Natives, it was on 2 fronts. One, eliminating and practically wiping out the food sources that were in place. And then on the other side was providing food that poisoned the people. And that's where, when we talk about food as medicine, we talk about the distinction between fry bread being a colonization and an oppression food, something that the people had to eat in order to survive, but it's not an ancestral food. Next slide, please. So, so I think, you know, one of the things that we look at when we talk about the indigenizing and re-indigenizing and decolonization is when we look at, you know, what's going on, not only here locally, but also movements around that have affected Native people. We need to look at how, and sometimes we have to be careful how we use certain language and approach the work. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But for example, sometimes using words like empower, I think it's adding to or enhancing that we're looking at, rather than looking at something and something's not there and thinking that we're bringing something to the people. So being real careful about what we look at when we are talking about food sovereignty initiatives and working with tribal communities to identify what their priorities are and what they're doing to address the food insecurity and food sovereignty initiatives. We have the highest rates of diabetes and also other health issues. And a lot of that is as a result of the impact of what's gone on with the history Mark talked about and touched on so well, and because those impacts are still here with us today. Next slide, please. You know, on this conversation of re-indigenizing and colonization, we got to look at how outside organizations are working and what their strategies look like. Again, these approaches sometimes come in with a deficit model, thinking that there's nothing in these tribal communities, and communities get very frustrated, or sometimes in response, sometimes agree to do something and work with, but sometimes the investment's not there because something's already been pre-prescribed, and the way that folks come in looking at it can sometimes just set things in a direction where it's not based in the community and what they're working on. The colonization model is continuing to bring in things from the outside in because they're better. So we have to take a look at, when we look at the decolonization, it also has to do with how we're approaching this work. Re-indigenizing means that there's knowledge, there's information already there that is still alive and vibrant, and taking from that and putting it towards these efforts that we're trying to connect with as outside organization. There's a lot of cultural preservation and restoration work that's going on because of the loss and the impact that Mark talked about when it was impacted by the plan to eliminate or exterminate or assimilate. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I'm moving my camera around because I'm working off of my phone. So some of the ancestral and traditional foods is that it looks different for every community. And so usually when we go, and I'll talk a little bit about our work as I share some of these, what we do is go in and work with and customize our services to a specific community. If we're at Apache, the Apache Nation, we work with local experts and we customize the work, the teaching, expanding the capacity building initiatives through training that we provide. But we also have to feed bellies. So we have 2 programs that operate. We provide food for today, but then we also at the same time provide capacity building initiatives that help our folks learn their own foods. Some of our folks have lost touch with their own foods. And so we've introduced foraging and traditional forms of preserving food so that folks can reconnect with their traditional ways. It's an amazing thing to see when and it's intergenerational, usually the exchanges that are taking place. So we have from the young to the elders. And sometimes when this engagement is taking place where we're doing the foraging or looking at the traditional forms of preserving food, a lot of stories get shared. So it's not just the food or the activity, but then everything else that surrounds those experiences. We have to make a distinction between ancestral food and traditional food. Fry bread falls into what is a traditional food. But as I mentioned earlier, it is a survival food. It came because of the oppression, because that's all the folks had to eat. And so now the tribes have given the country and the world fry bread. Next slide, please. So we follow an asset-based community development approach. This model has been around for 40, maybe about 40 years. And it's really looking at what are the strengths, what is there in the community, and then approaching it based on what we follow are 3 basic components. We listen, we inquire, and we learn. We're not the experts in the 60 reservations and the different cultural nuances, the language, the stories. We're not experts in that area. But what we can be experts at is in how we approach our work. And so when we look at the research and body of work that's been produced around asset-based community development work, you're not going to find many case studies that focus on tribal development. So essentially what we're doing is recording a lot of what we're doing to hopefully put something together that we can share with others that are involved in this kind of work and with this kind of approach. One of the things we found is that it's not how we do things and how we approach it is sometimes more important than what we are doing. For example, if we're focusing on food sovereignty, food as medicine, we can do the activities, but for Native people, it's not just the event, it's the process that's just as important. How we engage the community, are we prescribing? And so one of the things that I talk to our folks when we're working in the community, just we got to look at our own biases when we go into communities. Some we're working with that are at 28% unemployment. Others are at 90% unemployment. So you can imagine the economic impact, and that in itself is devastating. And so we are sometimes coming in with our own lens at what we're wanting to see, or judging what we're seeing. And so we got to do that work internally. It's an inside job as we approach our work. So our asset-based development approach focuses on a couple of things. Next slide, please. So our initiatives focus on capacity building. And one of the things that has been going on, and we've read that and we see that, and some of us are engaged in this work, is the return to our ancestral teachings, knowledge, our ways. And so with that, we went from hearing from our folks that they wanted to learn how to eat healthier and prepare healthier meals. So we started the whole process from a consumption, a physical approach, chopping, dicing vegetables. We used the My Plate initially, and then what happened is we got introduced to the Food as Medicine initiative through the practitioners that were out there working. They said, "Hey, you're a native serving organization. Why aren't you indigenizing what you're doing?" And so the door opened, because absent that invitation, what we go in and do is culturally appropriate. We have no right to take over what belongs to that community. But when that door opened, we were exposed to a whole army of food sovereignty practitioners who knew the stories, who knew the medicine, who knew the food. And so that changed our whole paradigm in how we engage. So we have a special relationship with our folks in every community that we have in how we approach this work with food as medicine. We're now doing a holistic approach. It's not just healthy eating, it's also physical, spiritual, mental, emotional. And so we do that through meal preparation, canning and traditional food preservation, food foraging, traditional gardening, and in some areas we've had to adjust some of the work in order to address what the local needs are. So we have some high tunnel and hoop gardening. Next session, next slide, please. Robin, am I close to time here? Is that what I'm seeing?
Yes, so, but please feel free to continue. I think those who needed to leave at the top of the hour have left, but the majority of our audience are still very interested in what you have to say. So I think I speak for the group when I say please continue, and Lisa's been tracking questions, and so please do continue.
Thank you very much. Well, some of our current initiatives are to support this approach from the capacity building, which is the training, and connecting with the practitioners that have the knowledge. And we have a network of folks that first opened the door to us because we were consistent, and they saw that we were trying to do something to improve the health outcomes to start with. And then when we got introduced to this whole paradigm of a holistic approach to indigenizing our work, they are now our go-to that help us to do that. But they also help us on the asset base, the investments that we're making. We have a portfolio, we have a strategy that we call a community investment portfolio, and it supports, it provides small seed funding, and some of the things that we've invested in, and we track that portfolio to look at outcomes. What impact is having in the community. What's going to happen is community based. And so we've made these modest investments, and we've seen some significant gains. We're at the point now where we're scaling up to much larger scale projects because of those outcomes. But some of the examples are we've had medicinal and herbal gardens at the shelters, homeless, schools, elder centers. We've engaged with the Beginning Farmer and Ranchers program. And so these are some of the things that we support. We might not do them ourselves, but we engage and support these. We've supported communities that grow food and then participate in some of these farmers markets. as well as, you know, helping to build out some of the community kitchen. We have our own mobile training units. We call one the Mutton, the Mobile Unit on Training and Nutrition, and that's in the Southwest. And then we have the WOW, the Wellness on Wheels, which is our mobile training unit in the Northern Plains. We don't call them food trucks because the first time people hear, oh, it's a food truck selling native food, or thinking that we're going to have fry bread and those kinds of things in there. We don't even have fryers in our food trucks. But the Mutton and the WOW go out, and they're really a training curriculum on wheels. Again, we shifted from just chopping, dicing to a whole paradigm. And those are the tools that we use to go out there and engage the community. Some of our communities don't have a commercial kitchen or a place to train. So we go and set it up and we start the training and we get things going. Next one. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned some of the practices that are going on, mobile training units, food pantries, etc. So at this point, some of the things that we're also getting from our practitioners are the recipes, and those are being shared with the community as well. So again, that creates, you know, supports the capacity building as well as the asset development. At this point, I think we're at the end of our presentation. So questions? Comments?
Thank you so much, Rafael, and thank you, Mark. There's been quite a few questions coming through, and you know, forgive us for our little technical difficulties at the beginning with the slide presentation. So actually, Lisa and I changed roles. So Lisa's been keeping track of the questions. So I'll hand the mic over to Lisa to pose those that came from the audience to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rafael and Mark. That was a fabulous presentation, and we had lots of great resources shared in the chat. So I'm hoping we'll be able to capture that and include that with the webinar when that's made available to folks, books and other resources. And I see also that your emails were put up in the chat, so you may get some additional questions after this. But so one question came at the very beginning, and it was about the organization not serving the state of Wyoming, and if there was a reason for that, since it seems to be in surrounding states.
So we went through a review of our footprint and where our partners were located, and we mean consistent partners year over year. Initially, we were serving Wyoming, Idaho, and then we were on the border of Washington. But those partnerships were not as strong. We did quite a bit of outreach, and we could not maintain a steady caseload, if you will. Maybe that's not the best word, of partners. But so we scaled back to kind of retool and focus on the priority states we have now, with the intention to look at what were we doing there. Maybe we have an opportunity to grow that again. So that's where we're at now. We're in a process improvement phase.
Great. Good, thank you. Another question had to do with the Wellness on Wheels program, and folks wondering if there was a website for that.
There's no website. We have the program that we administer communicated through our partnerships. We have a partner website specifically for those that are working with us. And then we have the public website, which is www.nativepartnerships.org. And so our partner website has information about the different services, including the WOW and the Mutton. And so because we target those for specific community initiatives in the 9-state footprint, that's how it's organized. But we can give access to folks who are interested in that, or give them a little bit more information.
Okay, great. If we're able to get that together before the end of this, we can maybe put that in the chat. Thank you for considering that. While on the topic of wellness on wheels, there was a question about how can non-native nutritionists be of the most value to Native communities?
I think we've always provided an array of information to our through our what we call the T3, train the trainer. And the train the trainer has the traditional, the contemporary, and so we try to provide as much of an array of resources to our tribes so that they can pick and choose what's most relevant. We always have local people, obviously, but we've partnered up with, you know, for example, in the South and in the Northern Plains, we've partnered up with South Dakota State University, the Ag Extension program, and they've done nutrition and training for us. So we're always willing to partner.
Great. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, and so that is always an option that even when you're talking about food as medicine or ancestral programs, knowledge is knowledge, and it's important to kind of explore different aspects of and perspectives.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in about sharing and partnerships, because apparently there's an invitation that just popped up in the chat from a person in Wyoming. So if with an invitation to contact them with regard to working in Wyoming. So there you go.
All right.
But
there's another invitation for seeking your participation in the next Native American Nutrition Conference in Minnesota also. So this is part of
we'll
what
have to make sure you both get access to this. I did have a question from Jonathan who asked, how can we get our towns to incorporate more Native American history into curriculums in schools? He says he feels like it's a huge problem in terms of how Indigenous tribes and Native tribes are taught in schools, and you know, with painting a negative perception and so forth.
Yeah, you know, there.
Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Rafael. I was just going to say that there, I would invite someone who's Native to come in, who has the history, who has the knowledge, and to share that perspective, I think would be important. You know, one thing I do want to mention is that a lot of the things we shared today, a lot of people didn't know that history. And sometimes there comes an emotional reaction because it's like, oh my gosh, you know, I can't believe we did this to Native people. And so the whole purpose is not to make people feel guilty or feel bad or, you know, feel that they need to do something now to, you know, to do reparations for that. But it's about us sharing who we are. I shared with Rafael, and I think Robin with you too, that as a Native people, this is part of our history, but this is part of who we are, has made us strong and resilient to this day. And it's kind of like a analogy would be like the Jewish people sharing both the time of the Exodus when they left Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, and that's when they became strong as God's chosen people to start their own nation. But then also through the Holocaust, how they survived that. And it was a horrible time, and there, you know, so many of them were wiped out, but they came together again as a nation and are strong as a result of that. So it's the same for Native people. You know, this is part of our history, and it's been horrible, and it's still difficult, but we are stronger, we are resilient, we are able to hold on to our culture and our traditions. And so that's what it's about, is to let people know we're here, we're not going away, and that we celebrate who we are. So having someone come in who is maybe an elder, who has the stories, who has the knowledge, you know, the history we've given is kind of like just little bullet points, but you know, this person could bring their own tribal perspective, what has happened to their own tribe in that town or in that state or in that region, and share it from that perspective. That would be my perspective on that.
So I have a couple other, you know, there's states that have passed legislation requiring content that the schools work with, and sometimes this is at the local district level, but they have passed laws that allow for a tribal history and other teachings to be shared in the school. That's up to the local, that's a local discussion. I'm also I joined a conversation with the Department of Education here in the state of Arizona, and we're looking at some of those things where we look at what kind of information needs to go into teaching and what's relevant. So I would support folks looking at what their state laws are around this, because there are some states, quite a bit of them, that have passed legislation supporting curriculum be embedded into the public school system.
Great, that gives folks a lot to go on, and I don't know, Robin, maybe you have a few more questions. There were a few more invitations that popped up. One particularly about trying to sort of have a conversation regarding the farmland succession movement and incorporating Native American Black farm workers. So that invitation will be in there as well. But maybe other questions popped up for you, Robin? That seems to be most of what was in the chat.
Yes, I'd like to put an invitation out to those who are still with us, because I saw a couple hands that were raised from the participants, and we weren't at a stopping point in the presentation where I felt comfortable interrupting Mark or Rafael, but I'd like to just pause for just a sec to see if you would like to put your hand up again.
And one thing I want to mention while we're looking for hands going up is we do participate in the Seeds of Native Health conference out in Minnesota. So we've sent people from our staff there the last 2 or 3 years that we knew about the program. It's a wonderful program, and but we would love to be able to present if they asked us to do that.
One of the areas that I did not touch on that is growing for us around food sovereignty is our work around emergency services. We initiated a program on preparedness and response. And one of the main priority areas for the communities we're working with, and these are communities that are really remote from food sources, they're defined as food deserts, is food access and access to healthier food. So we've now incorporated we've aligned food sovereignty initiatives with emergency, because some of these communities we're working with get hit by disasters, whether they're natural or people-made disasters on a regular basis.
Thank you. I didn't see any hands come up, so I apologize to those who put their hands up, and I'm sorry I couldn't get in there fast enough. And I hope that you'll feel comfortable to reach out to Mark or Rafael to ask those questions directly if you have them. I think, Lisa, we've covered most of the questions that I could find in the chat, and I just wanted to share, Mark and Rafael, I know it's hard to keep track of the chat at the same time that you're trying to keep track of the important things that you wanted to talk about, but I just want to share with you both so many kind words of appreciation for letting us learn from you. We got to participate actively in 2 steps of the asset-based community development, which is listen and learn. And I'm so appreciative of both of your time today. And yes, so folks are in the chat agreeing with those statements. So I hope we get to find ways to work together again. It's been a pleasure. And I think that you have perhaps some new community connections, through really the wonderful folks who join us at Food Systems Friday. So thank you so much. And, may you continue to do wonderful work and support all of those who do wonderful work.
Thank you so much.
We're very appreciative of this opportunity, and thank everybody. Stay safe and be healthy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Carla, perhaps, I think it's easier if you manage the recording.